Well, moving on to your role now as Scotch Parent President, have you diagnosed any problem with the parent body?
No, I haven't diagnosed any problems.
All right, I'd like to welcome Heather Cowan to Studio Scotch. This is a place that Scotch Parents has funded. Or a lot of this equipment has come from you guys, so it's the first time seeing it for you.
It is. It's exciting.
You've been a dietitian for 30 years, practicing in both private and hospital systems.
That's right.
And not only are you president now of the Scotch Parents, but you're also a member of the board for community choir. Is that correct?
I was, but I stepped down from everything actually, just to come and work
probably a few other things as
Scott.
well too, right?
And not to mention a Scotch mum.
Yes, that's right.
Well, thank you for coming in, and thanks for all your support in purchasing and getting Studio Scotch off the ground. First off, we're going to talk to you a little bit about your philosophy on education, being a Scotch parent, being the conduit towards from the parents to the Scotch community and teachers. What is your philosophy on education?
Philosophy on education. I think, well, it probably stands back, and my background education-wise is science, and it's funny. I remember clients and people saying to me, Heather, you can't stand it. It's always changing all the time. And I said, in fact, that's one thing I love about it, is the fact that it's continually changing. So my philosophy on education is that it's continuous. It's never ending. It's an ongoing process, and embrace it. And the other thing about education is make it as diverse as you can. So, one of the things I try and do now in terms of a philosophy is each day is actually try and read outside of my area of strength, maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, or the time that I might be having lunch, in a completely different area that can send me in a different direction. I really enjoy that.
Can I ask, so when you were, looking at schools for your kids and you settled on Scotch for your son, what were some of the characteristics of Scotch that really appealed to you and stood out to you?
I think, Sam, the main role that sort of stuck out was the International Baccalaureate program. And what we loved about that was that it was an international feel. It was a global type of learning. It wasn't just about Perth and WA. It went beyond that, but also the inquiry-based learning. We really liked that. The opportunity to just take a topic and just keep going with it. It wasn't like, this is the beginning, this is the end. You could actually just take it wherever you liked. So that was a huge huge draw card for us in terms of education here.
Do you think do you think a lot of people take that lifelong learning approach, or do you think a lot of people kind of settle into rest on their laurels a little bit and get a little bit too focused? Yeah,
that's a good question, Steve. And I think, look, it's difficult for me to answer that on behalf of other people. One question that I would have there would be is what would make people want to settle? And it might be that the background. I was lucky that my parents were pretty curious learners, and so they were passionate about everything. They were immigrants from England. So I think coming out to Australia, it was a novelty, and so they wanted to embrace everything. So they were constantly learning. They were really interested in science and nature. So, it wasn't that that's a bird. It was like, well, what kind of bird is that? So there was a lot of, curiosity there.
Yeah, and I always think if you do that from a child as well, you don't fear that kind of change and adapting to different things.
Exactly.
We were talking about adaptive intelligence. That was a book you read recently, I think. What did you get out of that book?
I think what I got out of it was, it's standard IQ tests when we're talking about intelligence. They tend to refer to it. They're fantastic if you want someone that can, recall vocab or are great at pattern sequences or number sequences, and they're fantastic if you've got problems that are very structured and standardised and there's a pattern within it. But they're not applicable to real life problems. Real life problems, dilemmas such as climate change and the coronavirus, for example. So what's different about adaptive intelligence to me is that there's a different scope of skills. So we've got creativity there. So if we use the example of coronavirus, you have to have someone that has the imagination to come up and think about that there would be an mRNA vaccine. And then the next skill that they would then need is that analytical skill. Well, how do I take this vaccine? I've then got to put it into clinical trials and make sure it's safe enough to use on the public. So that's the sort of second skill. And then you take that to a practical skill. Okay, we've got this, but how do we take a few doses into billions of doses? And then that fourth skill would be wisdom, which is a really important one to me, and that is for the greater good of man. I've got all this great gear here, but then how do I ensure that that is distributed to all countries and to those that most need it, the sharing of it, and also to have the wisdom to sort of realise that people are going to have different opinions and different ideas about it and concerns and fears, and how are we actually going to address those. So to me, adaptive intelligence is really vital because it's about real everyday problems and needing that skill set in order to sort of manage those.
And very broad solutions.
Is that Robert Sternberg? Is that the work? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so he's had like a long history in studying intelligence and theories of intelligence. I listened to a podcast with him the other day in it, talking about how he was looking at how you think about those versions of intelligence when you're looking at the admissions process for university. I'm not sure if he writes about that in the book, but could you talk to that a little bit?
Well, I think, that's very relevant. I think what was also relevant, in a lot of these sorts of studies about adaptive intelligence is that different cultures view intelligence on different levels. So, there was a reference made to, say, South America, where it's really important to have social skills, strong social skills. To them, recalling vocab isn't particularly impressive, but to have that connected community where they actually, in order to survive, they need to be, have the gift of the gab or be able to socially connect. Whereas somewhere else, they might need to have really, really important language skills. Or someone else might need to have more analytical or mathematical. It just depends on the situation.
The context.
Yeah.
Okay.
So raising your children, did you take on that approach throughout their early childhood?
Yeah, I think, it's always been about continuous learning, and I love it to hear my kids, my daughter who's studying medicine now, to her it's actually the ideal profession because she has to continually learn, and she, in some respects, sometimes I'll say to her, you can lay off the studying, but it's almost, you're driven to learn. And I was reading something interesting recently about medicine, and they were sort of saying that, there is the circumstance where a number of the specialties or specialisation can lead to a decline in knowledge over the years, with the exception of surgery, because surgery is the ultimate where the outcome, if you do something wrong on the surgical table, the feedback's pretty loud and clear.
Stakes are high.
Exactly, they are very high. So they're constantly learning. It's like, I'm faced with this situation, what am I going to do with regards to that? But what I would take from that is that I might raise that to my daughter and say, look, this is really interesting. And there's a very interesting book that I haven't started yet, called Range, and I don't know if you've heard about it. It's an interesting name. But David Epstein, and he's really looking at the importance of being a generalist as opposed to specialising early. And it's interesting because often when I'm talking about my daughter, the first question people ask me is, what's she going to specialise in?
One of the analogies in that book is actually it was if a cardiologist looks at some sort of problem and tries to diagnose it, he'll think it's something to do with the heart. Yeah. So actually having a broader understanding helps you diagnose problems as a medical practitioner.
Absolutely, and I think it's quite quaint. She used the expression recently that med students, it's called zebras, and they always think it's a zebra as opposed to a horse, or so they always think, oh my gosh, it must be the most obscure, rare disorder when they see a patient. And of course, the specialist would think there's no way, it's just going to be the common or garden one. Right. So there's a difference that they say. Be careful that you're not always looking for the zebra, that more often than not it's a horse. But you're absolutely right. If you've got a cardiologist who's looking for the heart things, and I think that relates to even my practice, a lot of people say the skills that you sort of develop, but I think that one of the things as an allied health professional is that you actually often have to step back and look at the whole person. So you're not just looking at, when I might be a dietitian, but that I'm really interested in the psychosocial aspects. I'm really interested in what drives this individual. I'm interested in what's happening at home. Can they even feed themselves? What are the skills there? I'm interested in what is their level of knowledge? Where am I going to go with the education here? You know, is this person at a really high level in which they're going to be bored if I just give them the standard common or garden? Or do they not even understand concepts? Where are they in their level of change? Are they even interested in what I'm talking about? Are they driven by this, or are they being told to do this? So there's so many influences that, you know, what are their personal feelings and thoughts about food? You know, what's it related to? Is it about social connection for them? And if I'm messing around with that, what am I, you know, who am I to go in and tell them that they can't have this? So it's really being sensitive to those.
You have to be very good at reading people very quickly,
yeah.
no doubt. Yeah.
So it's actually a privilege to be able to step back. These people are coming in very, very vulnerable. So I think that perspective of being a generalist, you have to be part psychologist, part this. You need to know your medicines. You need to know all those aspects. And I think going back to the kids and how they've been brought up, in fact, my daughter came back the other day and she said, thanks, Mum, the fact that you often talk about, she's on psychiatry at the moment, but she said just the fact that we're always talking at that level of empathy, or being able to walk in someone else's shoes and understand what they might be thinking about. And she said, you know, I've suddenly realised I actually have those skills within me, and I didn't realise it until, you know, today. And I was talking to one of the doctors and they realised that I already had that sort of insight, whereas other students might not have been exposed to that, and it takes them that time to catch up, whereas she feels she can sort of just be moving on from that.
And, and these are the skills you're just not going to see in a IQ test or in a traditional forms of you know, off educational measurements really, are they? Those intangible.
I guess that's why they've introduced those interviews to get into medicine now as well.
They have, to look at those sort of aspects.
And I wonder how much more of that's going to be involved in university entries, because we've seen a bit of a shift recently into how students are getting into uni from year 11 scores and all these early entry. It's changed a lot of the dynamic of school just in the last 2 years. I would guess some of your career highlights might involve maybe some of the more helpful things that you've done to people and really get involved in knowing who they are. Is that a good guess?
It is. I mean, you know, people say, why would you do that? But I'm very driven about making a change. It's enormously satisfying for me for that. And I think when you think about highlights for me, they're the surprises. They're not the predictable. They're the unpredictable. They're the challenges that come in. So I guess off the top of my head, if I think about a few of those, it might be really obscure things. I remember I was referred a paediatric patient, a boy. He was about 10 years of age. And he came in, and I now would probably dub him in my mind as the poly patient. And poly because he had a number of symptoms. So he had polyuria, which is excessive urination, polydipsia, excessive thirst, polyphagia, which is excessive food consumption or appetite, and polydactyl, he had an extra toe.
Wow.
Now, this is where the generalist approach came from. This boy presented to me, and he'd been sent to, you know, check, does he have diabetes? Does he have this? So every specialist in those particular line he was checked out and it was a negative. So out of sheer frustration, his GP said, look, go see Heather and we'll just look at and see if there's a dietary perspective. But in that, generally when a patient presents, we spend about an hour with them. So we have a lot of time with them. And I would probably spend the first half hour just taking a really detailed medical information history on that client or that patient. And during that time, you're asking lots of different questions. But for me, when all of these things start coming together, you sit back and you actually look at the overall. And I profoundly thought, gosh, this boy's got some really interesting things coming together. So often they might be going to see them, you know, if you're going to see a specialist that's just thinking about diabetes, they're not thinking, why is he also polydactyl? Why has he got an extra toe? What's going on there? Or hang on, this polyphagia is really interesting. And for me, that puts red flags up in a different place. You're looking at the whole. And what I would be looking there for is the potential for syndromes. Specific syndromes. So at the end of this whole session of an hour, I said to the mum, do you mind? Your son he's got these really interesting, you know, presenting symptoms. What I'd like to do is look at him a whole. I'm going to write a letter to your GP. And I went home and I Googled up a whole load of syndromes because I thought, this boy is really interesting. And so I wrote to the GP and said I would love him to be sent to, is it possible he could be sent to a paediatrician, because I'm thinking he might have this particular syndrome. And it turned out this boy went to the specialist, he got referred, and he actually did end up with a very rare syndrome, was referred to the Children's Hospital, and his bloods were being sent overseas. And it's one of those times that you get a phone call from a mum, and in fact she phoned me up to thank me purely because for the first time her son had actually been diagnosed with what was causing these problems. Now, you know, he was presenting with learning difficulties and all sorts of things that individually you would think it was something just on its own or something, but to step back, his bloods were being sent overseas because it was so rare, and she said for the first time she was getting support and he was getting support. So those they're absolute gems to me.
That's a perfect example, isn't it, of that integrated, you know,
problem solving.
Integrated problem solving that we talk a lot about on this show. There seems like there's been a revolution in holistic medicine over the last 10 years. I imagine you're well across all of that kind of stuff. Could you talk to that? My wife is she's an OT actually, and she's particularly interested in this movement towards understanding when a patient comes in, understanding the whole patient, and I guess avoiding, the whole push towards lots of diagnosing them, giving drugs, and actually solving those problems before it gets to that point. Is that right?
Yeah. And I guess,
roundabout way of...
And there's holistic medicine, and there's sort of also, the term functional medicine. And that is really looking back at, and I think we were talking before about systems. And if you consider the body to be a system of many systems put together, but some of the core pillars, I guess, of functional health or functional medicine is going back to some of the basics that we forget about. So, sleep being a really important pillar, exercise being a really important pillar, nutrition being an important pillar, and then we've got relaxation or, stress management. And often I think of adults and they might present they're under incredible stress, and, if we would think of a 2-year-old, they might be actually having a tantrum on the supermarket. But it's interesting, when I walk past that 2-year-old, and often I will turn it around and say, that's really traumatic for that child. They're not enjoying it. So we always tend to think about the poor mum or the poor dad. But for that child, it's actually, they're going through a horrible experience there and understanding what's going on. But we can understand that child might be hungry or tired. But in an adult, it's as if we're not allowed to play that out. But we might find that we're incredibly grumpy or not performing at our best or not being very well at all. We might be chronically unwell. And so I think that the whole idea of functional medicine or looking at the holistic thing is going back to the core basic biology, I guess, that we were designed to do things in certain ways. We were meant to probably wake up with the sun, go to sleep with the sun, and, we were in social environments because we required that in order to survive. We would find it very difficult to hunt or to gather if we didn't have that group. We couldn't have that. So we've required those sorts of things. But in terms of those groups, we'd probably be sitting around a fire at night time talking about things and that sharing stories, and that would be de-stressing us as well. And from a nutrition point of view, we wouldn't be able to go down the supermarket aisles and be completely flabbergasted by the choice of it. We'd be pretty core in choosing things around us. It would be diverse, but there would be things that probably our body was actually meant to have. Yeah.
I remember reading about a guy, Yuval Harari, wrote this great book called Sapiens, Brief History of Humankind, and he said we really were at our peak when we were hunter-gatherers in terms of our nutrition and our cognitive capacities. What do you think about that idea? That was a kind of like a heightened point for our, physical and mental integration, I guess.
Well, I think it speaks to the fact that humans are incredibly adaptive. The fact is that back then I wonder whether, nowadays we have longevity because we've adapted by creating medicines or things that we can actually provide. So I think, though, in terms of if you were to look today at certain issues, and particularly, in the area of mental health, for example, or people being stressed or on many medications, we often look to that as being the solution as opposed to going deeper, which is what's causing the problem in the first place. We're really good at putting Band-Aids over. We're really good at saying, let's just make a quick fix and prop you up and put you back, but it takes a lot more work. So I suppose when we look at our hunter-gatherers, they didn't have that as an option. And I remember as a new grad in the hospital, and I had a resident a doctor who's, just recently graduated, come up to me, and I was speaking to her, and she was actually saying, this patient isn't on vitamin supplementations. And I just looked at her and I said, do you think back in hunter-gatherer days that they used to be able to walk into the supermarket or the pharmacy and pick up the multivitamin? And she just stopped and thought for a moment, because to her it just seemed like the norm, of course. And then she suddenly thought, yeah, that's a good point, that we did have that diversity. Whether things were, I think they would be better in terms of stress management and how we were dealing with our bodies, and whether we weren't necessarily getting the types of diseases that we're seeing nowadays, for sure.
Well, moving on to your role now as Scotch Parent President, have you diagnosed any problem with the parent body?
No, I haven't diagnosed any problems.
What are some of the roles and things that you've been getting involved in, getting excited about with Scotch Parents?
Yeah, I think the biggest, it's really exciting, and it's such a privilege actually being able to talk to the parents across the board. But one of the main things is really just Scotch actually has an amazing community. So it's already existing, but for me it's about strengthening that community. And I guess one of the directives has been as well is extending and expanding that community beyond the walls of the college campus. And that is to include past parents as well as the community around. So I think, it's been a great initiative from the school that they would like to embrace that. And there's an interesting thing, as parents often leave Scotch, there's probably 50% that are really happy that they're going, and 50% that really grieve it. It's quite a loss to them being involved in the school. So what I've been involved in is creating activities where we can bring back those parents back into the school grounds and reconnect them with the school.
And do you get involved with disseminating information about what's going on at the school as well, and talking about the kind of innovative things we're doing here?
Yeah, so we're very fortunate to have 36 year and class reps, and so we distribute most of the information through there. And then we've this year has seen special newsletters go out to past parents. So there's obviously the OSC boys that get their newsletters. So we're trying to look at every avenue that we can to get that information out. And then there's the word of mouth, which is really strong. So the choir, for example, that we commenced this year to look at, activities that we could incorporate all those groups to be able to come in. We actually had people come and say, well, we've got Scotch Parents, is it okay if I bring my friend who's a PLC? So we opened up to PLC. And then we had other people say, look, my friend from the community wants to come along, and I asked, and they said, yes, we can open up to that. So it just keeps growing and growing in terms of where we can draw upon that.
And I think you're making some really big differences from what I've seen. I've had a bit of involvement with you in terms of the STEM Startup Club, and we've provided funding for boys to begin their own businesses. Mm-hmm. We've had, I think you got the biggest ever parent meeting to come along that night, where the boys were pitching their ideas to try and find funding. We've had a new laser cutter funded for the middle school. The STEM Startup Club, how was that received?
I think incredibly well, and really, it's been nice to be able to utilise the Scotch Parents meeting to showcase what's going on within the schools.
Well, and actually make an impact as well to what students are doing.
Yeah, well, that's amazing, and we love to see that. And I think parents are really happy to see that their funds are being used in such a way to, fund these boys that are excited initiative and take to, know that feeling, what it's like to be supported and take it to the next stage. Talking about that, it's not an easy process. They have to go through the fund application process and go through and work really hard in order to even get there. So it's nice to be able to reward them with that.
And it's quite authentic too. They had to pitch to you, and it had to be decent. They had some pretty high-level parents in that room asking some pretty high-level questions.
Yeah, and we're very privileged here in our Scotch community. I mean, I gave a fairly short notice, but when you mentioned it, I thought we could have the concept of making a mini sort of Shark Tank approach. And so once again, using the network of the Scotch parent reps, I was able to put that out and say, look, it would be lovely if you know of anyone in the community, entrepreneurs, that we could create this environment to give the boys some feedback. And they've been incredibly supportive, those parents, and I'm appreciative. And in fact, this time round, part of that is for this next meeting is to follow up on the boys' stories, where they're going next.
It's just great how much you take an idea and then run with it. Often, it gets frustrating if me with an idea might try and have to push this every step of the way, but you grabbed it and you took it further and really made a difference, which is really appreciate. It's done incredibly well for those couple of boys that have been part of that, and I think it's quite inspiring for younger boys now. We can start a little bit of a culture to see that, this is what's possible.
Yeah.
We funded virtually an entire business out of school from year 9.
Yeah, which is fantastic. And, to then incentivise and put, that excitement into the younger boys is exactly what we want to hear. And parents love that and the opportunity to come and see that. There were so many excited parents, and the feedback and the emails that came back was amazing. And, just recently I invited those parents that did come again to say, look, we're following on with the story, and they're really passionate. They're saying if you need further mentoring, so there's opportunities for us to run those sessions again and use that as a forum to showcase what's happening here.
Yeah, it is going further as well. There's been a company started, there's been presentations at agricultural fairs. It's likely he might do a TED talk as well.
Fantastic.
So it'll really showcase what we've done. Anything else you're doing with the Scotch parents? I think you've been involved in the kindy. There's a walking group. What else is going on?
So I like to have themes. So this term has been about creativity. So connecting the community with creativity. So in a couple of weeks we've got next Scotch parents meeting. But when I talk about creativity, it's not just what we consider, just drawing for the sake of drawing. I'm talking about social well-being, looking at improving people's quality of life. So we know that there are certain activities that affect people at that level. So we've got the choir, which is fantastic. So basically what's been happening on Mondays, I take the walking group around in nature, because we know there's a lot of benefits there. On Wednesdays, I'm singing with them in the evening at choir. On Friday morning, tomorrow morning, I'll be in the art workshops that we've started up with parents. And on Saturdays, I'm dancing, Scottish dancing, and we've got that connection going on. Next weekend, we'll also be running a cooking course. And a lot of these might just be little ideas. I might hear a parent say, my son loves cooking and he would love something like that, or I like this. And Scotch is very strong on the sporting front, and it's fantastic as a connection for those families. They get to meet up during their term with their sports that are specialised, and they develop really close connections. But I also appreciate that there are some boys and parents that, sport isn't their area, and so it's lovely to be able to provide activities for those parents. And my favourite thing is, I was here last night for choir. Actually, the breaks, believe it or not, when I come upstairs from choir in the chapel and I can hear this roar of conversation downstairs, that is incredibly satisfying. I just think that's amazing. So last night, and during the break, actually trying to drag them out of the break to come back again to the singing. So the connections that are occurring during those. And then as I was leaving, there were still parents all the way up, dotted up to the car park that were still staying back and talking. And, it offers that opportunity for people to come and de-stress. I heard one mum saying, this is my 2 hours of the week that is my time to just be completely absorbed into something that's creative for her. And to hear that's amazing, and it's wonderful. And also same in the walking group. Sometimes we talk about really quite profound and sometimes very deep. The other week we were talking about youth suicide. And you'd think these topics come up, but because we're walking, we're in nature and we're walking around, it's far more acceptable to talk about it. And what you'll have is half a dozen or 2 or 3 people talking about these really deep topics. And everyone, it's kind of in a trust situation. There's no judgment. We're just walking around the lake, and everyone somehow has a story or something that they can contribute. And by the end of it, there's a rewarding sense that everyone's spoken about something that's quite serious, but it's not like they feel threatened or anything, and there's solutions and ideas and support that comes about in those. So sometimes those walks are amazing, and we go through so many different topics from there. So
And you put any of them into practice? Any of those ideas that have been talked about? Have you?
Yes, and I think, there might be a conversation that comes from those. So, it might be the art workshops, or it might be bits and pieces that come from that, or, there's other ideas for me that come from those days. So with everything, all of these, I always consider life as a bit of an experiment. So I often say, great, let's go with it. I'll set it up. Let's think of it as an experiment, a pilot test, if it works really well. And then it might be the next stage on from that. So it might be, okay, we set up these workshops. And it's also looking at the talent within the teaching staff here as well. So, with Jane, when I approached her about running workshops and actually put it to her, was there an area of interest that she had or a passion? She did her study in printmaking, so we've been running the workshop with that. And her enjoyment, she's so buzzy and enjoying it. And I love to see that, because it's almost like giving something back to the staff as well. It's appreciating the talent and depth of talent within the school. And it's exciting for them.
Yeah, it's good to do something you're passionate about. That's something we've been trying to get going for a while, is passion projects.
Yeah.
I always have a little one going on every now and then, but it's kind of hard to squeeze in.
Yeah.
You've just made me realise, actually, that Scotch parents might like to be involved with some of Akram, our scholar in residence, who does philosophy lectures
Absolutely.
with boys on Friday afternoons.
Yeah.
And that would be great to have parents in the room as we kind of wrestle with ethical scenarios. I think some parents might be keen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And do you hear some good points and bad points about school through those walking groups?
You do, and that's a really good conversation. There are conversations that come up about, their sons and how their sons are coping. There's those that are doing extremely well, and there's those that might be going through really hard patches. And it's a really nice environment, because you'll actually have a lot of empathy from parents saying, my son's feeling like that. And it's a good opportunity for me to hear that, because I can feed that back as well to the school. And, often one of the things I find too is that it's really important for parents to realise that the school wants to know that information, and it's an opportunity to feed that back.
So how do you feed that back to individual teachers, or do you go through a different system?
Yeah, so I usually have meetings once a week that I set up with Kate Quinn and Mel Collins, and we, any of those sorts of things we'll talk about there, and they'll filter those back. But it gives me an opportunity. For me, it's really good so a typical example might be that someone's, a lady might be talking to me about a son who she's concerned about might having some learning difficulties, but she's only sort of picked it up. And she was new to the school, and her son's coming at year 9. And her question to me was, shall I just let it go? Do you think that the school will pick it up, Heather? Or what shall I do? And I said to her, look, if I was probably at the junior school level, there's probably a greater level of screening going on at that, because there's a smaller class group size and the intervention there. But it's really helpful for the school if you actually came in and had a chat to them about your concerns, because it can flag it for your son, it can fast track it, and the school needs that feedback rather than allowing it. But most importantly, we're talking about your son. And if we want to do the best that we can, if the school wants to support him, they can only do as in terms of knowing what's going on with the problem. And so that allowed her to realise that it's okay. And I think the thing there too is that just like even as a practitioner, if I had clients coming or patients coming in, I would say to them, I may not be the personality for you, or I might be the right one, but you need to find the right person that you can sort of gel with or feel secure and safe with in order to go through that. And it's a similar sort of thing at school. I think that parents need to feel that if they identify with a particular teacher or it may be the house head, it may not be the house head, but it's still important to engage with that person and provide that feedback, because any feedback is better than no feedback for the school. There's nothing worse in a situation where things are being spoken about the school, and the school's not being given the opportunity to say, gosh, if we'd known that, we'd actually intervene, and we'd be really happy to follow up on that.
This sounds like a really powerful space for them to be able to feed that back now.
Exactly. And, to sort of encourage them. And I guess it would be lovely too, even from the school, whether there's, they might sort of say, look, Heather, it would be great if we could have perhaps, or maybe you need to have a discussion with this particular these particular people. But we've got great infrastructure. We've got good pastoral care. We've got fabulous, psychologists that work at the school as well, and they're extremely well regarded. But I think for some parents, they can sometimes feel a little bit, they don't want to label their son. They're just curious about it or concerned, and where do they go with that first?
It sounds like that could almost be an employed role at the school.
Exactly.
It sounds like it'd be quite consuming as well. Do you still have time for your other career? Do we have anything else? Do we want to go to our special questions?
Phase 2?
Yeah. Enter phase 2.
Oh, okay, like our quickfire questions.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Was there anything else that you
actually
want? Like, I wanted to throw it out. Is there anything else that you feel like you wanted to discuss before we cut you off?
Well, I mean, it depends whether it's coming from the quick fire, but certainly for me, one of the things that when we're looking at schools and when we come back to it, and one of the things that I've loved about being in my role is actually being able to go and talk to the not only the parents and the boys, but the teachers within the school, and that has been amazing. So yes, like yesterday I was talking about, I was running an experiment in the kindy class, and that gave me an opportunity to go and speak there, and the wealth of knowledge there. But
I just think having you is someone who actually provides some sort of solution and doesn't make your life harder as a teacher is actually quite beneficial. And I think, I think a lot of the teachers here would really appreciate that as well. So, the more connections you have, I think, with the teachers, the better. Yeah.
Well, for me, it's just fabulous. Even when I came into this, talked to you guys down at the D&T building, it was amazing. And, going in there, and I sort of think, gosh, every parent would love to know this, and so that's why I've tried to bring things to the Scotch Parents meetings. And one of the things to the teaching staff here, if there are things that you're passionate about, if there are things that that are going on in the school that you would like the parents to know about, then we've got this new forum and platform that we can provide those. And so I try and sort of think of a theme. So this one's about creativity that's coming up, and so we're looking at showcasing not only where the STEM boys are, because of course STEM is a hugely creative process, but we are looking at, the other areas. So the choir will be performing this time round. So I've given them the challenge of in a couple of weeks to perform, and that gives them something to work towards. We're looking at the laser cutter, and obviously I'll be talking about these creative experiments that are going on.
The parents are part of the choir, yeah? It's all
That's
parents?
right, Scotch Parents Choir.
And where are they performing?
So in the chapel, so that'll be in the first few minutes of the meeting.
Yeah, right.
So they're all excited about that. Some a bit scared.
Can I ask, what kind of songs do they sing?
Oh, you
is
have
it
to.
Contemporary or traditional, or the whole mix?
We do a whole mix of songs, which is fabulous.
Who did the arranging?
Yeah, so we have it's a musical director, Jackson Griggs, and we also have an accompanist, Robert Graham. So we're really lucky, the dynamic duo as we call them, and they're fantastic. So, one of the important things for me when I was putting the choir together was looking at it being a professionally directed choir, but one where it was non-auditioning. It accepted anyone, and it's just lovely. We've got parents that have
You're
never...
not regretting that decision?
Not at all, not at all. In fact, I actually think these parents are incredibly brave and wonderful. One of the things I introduced was that in the first 5-10 minutes, I get one of the parents to come up and talk about how they got into music, which has been a lovely story for us each week, and we find out, where it came from. I mean, some people say, I'm not professional or whatever, but everyone's got a story, and we're all fascinated by it.
So how did you get into music?
I got into music. My parents were both musical. They came from very musical from England. So Dad was very much the chorister, and we always listened to King's College, Cambridge, and Mum was more the brass band background. And when they came out to Australia, so as a young child, I did join a choir. We were kind of the family that had every musical instrument. We probably couldn't play them all for sure, but it was encouraged to just give it a go. So I remember, I'd have friends that come over and we'd have these jam sessions in the lounge room, and they're just every instrument, and they'd just look at me and say, what do I do? And I'd say, just grab anything and just give it a go. There's a percussion sticks over there, just give it a go. And I think that probably is a good, philosophy of life. Just give it a go, don't worry too much about it. And I think that's the thing with singing. A lot of people, everyone will go, it's the same in the art workshops as well. People say, I can't draw, I can't sing. And then you'll hear people say, well, that's because you've been told you can't. doesn't mean you can't. And so it's really empowering. So I'm really excited because this Scotch Parents meeting allows an opportunity for people that have never sung before in a choir to sing. And I think you'll be amazed.
Well, we'll soon see.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll film it for you.
But just going back to the teachers and keeping their passion, for me, one thing I'd love to see is their passions being realised. And, you know, that's been an opportunity where even with the art workshops, having a chat to Jane about where her passion area is, which is printmaking, but also other things that she might like to have for the boys here at the school. And it's lovely to be able to see some of those eventuate. The other thing I'd really like to see is I'm pretty passionate about autonomy. And I know that we often have time for professional development, but it's often about things that are related to the work rather than your intrinsic passions. And so I'd love to see something like that 15% or 20% time.
Google do the 20%? Is it Google?
They do, yeah.
Yeah, let's bring that in.
Yeah,
Can
let's
you
bring it
organise
in.
that for us, please?
Can we ask for 20% off?
I'd love to see that. And
we'll just increase the fees. That'll sort it out.
But I think when you realise what comes from those, so, you know, 3M Post-it notes, you know, Google Maps, Google World, all amazing things that come from staff being inspired to be given time. And, it, you know, just as much as an afternoon.
Yep. I'm with you. Totally with you. All right, quick fire
questions. So you're on a deserted island.
Yes.
And you've got a chance to have one album.
One album. Gosh.
We've had Blood on the Tracks. Alec.
Oh, is that right?
We've had
Ben Folds.
The Police.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Police.
Yeah.
What else have we had? We've had...
I just watched
Alan Harvey had a couple of classical pieces.
Yeah,
I
some
can't
that I
remember.
didn't know.
Oh, yeah. Well, I do have to say I am a bit of a fan of the Police, but I also love Paul Buchanan from the Blue Nile, and I don't know if you've ever heard of them, a little more sort of obscure band from Scotland, but they have some amazing music, so perhaps one of their albums would be that, you know, the go-to there.
Are they contemporary or are they...
Contemporary,
oh, okay.
yeah, back in the 80s, so we're talking about him,
okay.
Steve.
Yep.
But I was lucky to be brought up with such an eclectic mix from classical through to popular music, so I actually love... It would be difficult for me to choose just one.
Okay. In terms of books that have had the most sort of profound impact on you in the last 5 years, beyond adaptive intelligence, what other books would you recommend as quite life-changing for you?
The latest one I've been reading in the past month or so is called The Art of the Impossible, Stephen Kotler. And that's looking at the concept of flow. And I'm not sure if you've heard about that, but it's really looking at that state of consciousness when we perform at our peak and feel at our peak. And for those, I guess, when you talk about flow, it sounds very hairy-fairy, but we're really talking about peak performance or being in the zone. And that's been an amazing book because we're really looking at biology, you know, so we can talk to, you know, things that work for me might not work for someone else. And I think this is particularly relevant even when I was working with patients. It might work for one, but it may not work for the other. Whereas biology sticks for everyone. And what I mean by that is that, you know, that certain situations or being in certain environments, we produce neurochemicals or particular chemicals that are reward chemicals in situations. So when you're talking about boys that might just be lacking or have the apathy, I'm thinking, what's going on there? They're not creating that curiosity.
And the context shifting that goes on so much in their lives at the moment. Every time an email pops up or, you know, their phone buzzes, it's really hard to get into that flow state.
I was going to ask that. I mean, do you think from what you've read about flow, there's a degree to which you require a fair solitude, some degree of solitude when in that mode? Maybe not for all kinds of activities, but... I mean, that's such a good question, Sam. So there's two things that are going on there. We do need me time, which is time by yourself for that creative thinking. But there are, and when we stem back to what I've been talking about in terms of creativity, they're not just random choices of these things that I'm doing. So flow can occur in group situations. So singing in a choir,
probably releases about 4 or 5 of these neurochemicals. We're layering them upon. So we'd have dopamine, which is released as a feel good when we start listening to or singing music, and it makes us feel good, that favourite album. And then we might have a little bit of noradrenaline, which is like adrenaline. Now, adrenaline and noradrenaline in the brain, as it's called, might create a little bit of curiosity at first. If we get too much of it, we start to get anxious, and if we get way too much of it, it creates terror. So you can see how we have that sort of broad spectrum. We've got oxytocin, that's our social hormone, but that opens us up to thinking about and being far more creative in different ways, that bonding that goes on in a choir. And then we've got endorphins, and we keep layering it up. So what we're looking at in terms of those sort of, so walking in nature, for example, I think with the boys it's a little bit different. They've been brought up completely with the IT and phones, and what we're finding there is that we're competing with those. When they get that ping on their phone, that actually releases dopamine on the brain. It's a reward hormone. So what we've then got to be is novel. So the sorts of things that create the release of reward hormones is something that's either a little bit novel or a little bit risk-taking. So I guess...
I found this an interesting dilemma for teachers, because if boys have exposure to a lot of technology throughout the day, there seems to be a need for increasing levels of novelty in how you engage students as a teacher.
Start singing and dancing to get their attention.
Well, that's not such a silly thing, Steve. Often people have asked me that, what would you do? And I said, well, because I actually really enjoyed teaching and mentoring students when I was there, and I didn't need to necessarily deal with that. But if I were to take a group of boys now and I was running a class, I would do something as bizarre as if I had a whole load of drums, and I'd just get the drums out and I'd say to the boys, grab these, I don't mind what it is, but I just want you to come up with the same tempo. So they may all start completely different. We sometimes do that in a choir as well. You might say, everyone sing a note, and then I eventually want you all to get to the same note. Or it might be, if I'm running a maths class, I might say, well, I've got to make this novel or slightly risk-taking. So if I'm learning, let's do statistics and probability, why am I not thinking about, okay, statistics, if I've got a subset of group of boys here that are really interested in sports, I'm going to give them problems associated with sports and I want them to solve that. Or I've got a different group here that might say, what is the probability of me getting a hot date from going on the recent river cruise? So that there are kind of problems that I guess get them a little bit curious about that. There's the novelty of it. We know that there's certain situations, improv, for example, getting boys up and just getting them into some improv at the first. Comedy is particularly useful, like that stand-up comedy. So you might start off with something bizarre, saying, look, there is a blue elephant in the lunchroom at the moment. Or to the teaching staff, you might say there's a blue elephant in the lunchroom, someone might say, I hope it doesn't use up all the coffee, because I could really do with a drink. So you don't want to have that sense of, no, this is ridiculous. It's like, yes, it is ridiculous, but we're going to run with that and get everyone incorporated in that. And that starts to send, it's just novel. It starts them off. Or I might say, look, guys, what's top of the hits this week? And at the end of the term, let's find out what the top term were according to us, or let's just rank them. Often giving boys a piece of paper, because we've actually found when you're scribing, there's something very different that goes on between that hand and brain connection, as opposed to we're always on devices typing away. So I still, use notebooks. And in fact, I actually get up extra early in the morning, about 5 o'clock, just to write for an hour and read. So that's just something I've started getting into in the past year or so, where I get up early, it's my time, and I try and get into that zone where I just think creatively. And they often say that, and even the structuring of classrooms or the timing of periods that you would work for, the ideal is about a 90-minute cycle
to actually
called? Get into it.
What kind of I can't remember the name of the cycle.
Yeah.
I'll remember it as soon as we finish.
But it seems to be that peak time.
Yeah.
With regards to that sort of side.
So I'm not quite sure what you mean. Do you mean in terms of the 90-minute cycle of...
Yeah, just getting engaged into something. So you might set them up to do some improv, and then you'll say, we've got this, problem or whatever. I want you to work on it solidly for a 90-minute period of time. That seems to be the ideal sweet zone for you to work on and concentrate really sort of hard on that. what we're doing in, say, the improv or the beating of the drums or singing or whatever it is we're engaging those reward hormones that they'll be normally getting from playing a game or doing those sorts of things. It's novel. It's a little bit risk-taking. It's like when we get, you might take them, and I've always thought about this and joked a little bit about, we should just do esports for parents as well, because they're obviously highly exhilarating. They're releasing all those sorts of, reward hormones in the brain.
They're very well engineered for flow, right?
Exactly, they are, or surfing, or situations like that. So, or getting boys out of the classroom. Nature is amazing, and we're very much structured to look in awe. Every time I see a rainbow, it still impresses me. It doesn't matter how many times. I can think about the physics about it, the refraction of light, but at the end of the day, it looks amazing. And so that's one of the reasons why I started the nature walks, was because, in fact, walking around the lake, I know that we're inducing those or releasing those types of hormones within the brain. The conversation gets flowing. The conversation can be incredibly diverse, and we're talking about these amazing topics as we're going around there.
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot about experiential learning, and in terms of engagement, actually where students learn the most is when they learn by doing. So it's taking any abstract concept or anything you want to teach and turn it into something they actually feel like they're experiencing will raise their level of engagement and how much they remember it and all that kind of stuff. So it sounds like those kind of activities are very much immersive, experiential. You're going walking, singing. They've all got movement.
Absolutely, yeah. So they're the reason why dancing is another one. The art activities. So I'm constantly thinking about those, and what we're also creating is those connections, so that the advantages that we're having of that are the psychosocial. We know that we're flushing out those stress hormones like cortisol. We've got reward hormones coming in there. We've got oxytocin. We're bonding. And the physiological effects are amazing in terms of health benefits. So the study and research really support the fact that we have improvements in cardiovascular, immune and endocrine health just from those activities alone. So, for me, that people don't realise that I might be doing this behind the scenes. That's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about, wow, we're creating these connections, but we're also improving the well-being. So when people ask me about why do I do this job, why would you want to take up that? Because what I know in terms of life satisfaction and well-being, and certainly for me, is that when we're curious about, people say, why do you do it? And I'll say, because first of all, I get curious. When you present me with a problem, I get curious about it. And then I'll go and read, probably in that first half hour of the morning, or it might be at lunchtime, and I'll read about that. If someone, I'm thinking, I haven't got a clue about this, but I'm going to find out a bit more about it. And then I transfer that to being passionate about it. I'll go, someone's given me this problem, but now I'm curious. I've moved that up now. I'm going to get really passionate about that. And
I think that's what students need to understand a little bit as well. Is when you do get involved with something, you do end up getting a little bit more passionate about it.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not interested in that. I can't be bothered. But, when you get involved, it just gets so much more
And,
interesting.
that makes me curious in a sense. So that student, I want to come in there and I sort of say, why is it you're not interested? And what are you interested in? So when I had patients, I would be interested in very much finding out what their background is, because then I could find out what their interest was. It meant that in my education, everything would be related to their passion or their interest. So even if it wasn't relevant to me, and often I'd talk to them about, being really visual. I was often drawing things. So I was the kid that did, physics, chem and maths, but I also took art. I did oil painting. So, I'd be the kid that was waking up at 5 a.m. in the morning to do oil painting before coming back and doing the physics, chem labs in the evening. But the combination of the two for me was amazing, in that you can use that to the creative side as well as the analytical side is really helpful. But going back to that, I'd be looking at the visual thing. I'd often say to patients, I'm going to put a toolkit around. We're going to put one of those belts around you that you can get from Bunnings. And each time we're going to come up with a tool that we can put into one of those pockets, it being a skill that you learn in order to be able to achieve the outcome. So I take it from curiosity to passion. I'm really interested to know. So if I have someone that is a builder, then all the analogies I use are about building, and it makes sense to them. If I've got a mechanic, everything's about a car. and it makes sense to them. So it doesn't become a body, it becomes, well, we're talking about the fuel line here, or we're talking about the engine. And you can relate everything and create an analogy or a picture for them. And then they get passionate about it because it relates to them. So if I've got a boy that's not interested, I'm thinking, so yesterday in kindy, there was a little boy there after we'd run the experiment. He had a sore ear. And the teacher said, "You don't mind?" And I said, "No, not a problem." You know, I was pretty excited. I'd made imaginary popcorn with a parachute in between the wriggling break, and that was fantastic. I was sitting with him, and I was looking up at the wall, and I said, "Oh, any of these pictures that you had drawn?" So he pointed out his picture of the flowers up on the wall. And we spoke about that, and I said, "Do you have any flowers at home?" And he said, "Oh, actually, I live in an apartment, so I don't." But rather than looking at the negative, we started to think about what might be positive about that. Now, he knew he was going to move, and he said, "Oh, I'm actually going to be moving, though, and I'm going to be on level 61. And I said, "Level 61, you'll be able to see the aeroplanes there." And he said, "I'll be above the clouds." And I was thinking he probably won't be, but I'm not going to tell him that. So I said, "Wow, above the clouds." And I said, "Have you got a favourite planet?" And he said, "I do. Pluto's my favourite planet." And I said, "Wow, why is Pluto your favourite planet?" And he said, "Because it's got icicles on it." And I said, And I said, "Do you know why it's so cold?" And he said, "Never thought about it." And so then we had the discussion of, when you go outside here today, what makes you feel warm? And he said, "The sun does." And I said, "Brilliant. So let's have a think about Pluto." And I thought, I'm not going to tell him it's not a planet. That's his favourite planet. I know it's a dwarf planet, but we're not going to go there, buddy. So I said, that's amazing. So what happens when you walk further and further away into the shade? He says, "I get colder." And so where is Pluto? And he says, it's like at the end, Heather. And so we're visually just like, I'm saying, "Well, is it here or here?" And he says, "Well, it's right at the end." And I said, "All right, so when you walk away from the sun, you're telling me you get really cold." And he says, "Yeah, I do." And I said, "So imagine Pluto's really far away from the sun. Here, what's happening?" He said, "Well, it's cold because it's far away from the sun." And I said, "You're amazing. You've just explained to me now why Pluto is cold." And he looks at me so content and so pleased with himself that he's just, in that short period of time, explained to himself and come to terms with the fact of he understands now why Pluto is cold, and in his own little terms. And it was just amazing, that conversation that we had then. But it was creating something that he was passionate about, his planet, what he was interested in, and then taking it back to why might that be. So I guess when I've got people that are stifled by that, and then the next thing is taking passion and adding a purpose to it. So that's the first thing I always do. Curiosity to passion, then create a purpose. What's my purpose for Scotch Parents is that people matter to me, making a difference in their lives, and with every patient and every person I see. It doesn't matter if it's 1 or 100. Like I think I was mentioning to Steve before, sometimes, some of the reps will be concerned at the numbers that turn up to a coffee morning. And I said, I'll go if it's 1 person, and I'll go if it's 100, because you can make a difference to that person's life or that conversation. And I said, sometimes it's really nice when it's a small crowd, because you can really get to know them well, and you can bond with them a lot better, and they feel like people love to talk about themselves. They really enjoy that. So for me, adding that purpose to it, takes it up to that level. That
seems to me to be one of the most important things I reckon we need to help our students with, is how do you take the passion? Because boys here have millions of different passions, but then how do you take it to the purpose where it has a bit of a moral dimension to it, or something that
absolutely
has a meaningful, where that wisdom side, I guess, comes in, is tough too, because I guess when you're a young person and you've got your parents telling you this is what I want you to do, and the school's telling you what to do, how you develop your own sense of purpose is a challenge, I think.
And I think, often I think about Scotch Parents and think, wouldn't it be lovely if we could support a passion project, or that it's almost like boys can aim for that, present a bit like your STEM,
we could
but
look into
outside of just STEM, that boys within the school could look at, I've got a particular passion, and create a purpose. Because for me, the best advertising that you have is someone like Ethan, who's taken his project and inspires other boys. Well, if we've constantly got boys inspiring others, that's all you need. And then but what we're talking about is boys. If boys are being stifled and have apathy, to me that's because we're not we're not getting them curious to move to that passion level because it's not something that means something to them. So we need to look at, I guess, education encompassing, it's not a one size fits all. It's like, I need to learn these maths problems, but it's not relevant to me. But gee, if it was about how I could get a hot date, I might be interested in that. Or, we talk about just things relevant to life, and stories and things like that make it really interesting. And I'm interested to know what the passions are of the boys in our school, so that we can then keep moving it on and that. And I think, like you sort of said, there'll be those couple that take it through, but those couple of boys can then make a big difference to another group. And particularly if they see cool equipment like 3D drones and all those sorts of things happening around the place.
Yeah, well, that wasn't a quick fire question at all, Sam.
Sorry.
I think the last one was normally what have you done in your life that's new, that's made an impact? But I think you pretty much all the habits.
Yeah,
you pretty much got them all covered. Reading in the morning and trying new things and continually learning.
Yeah, and a lot of that has come about through an empathy, because I am actually a migraine sufferer, and I've had migraine since I was about 10 years of age, and probably got me into the health area. But it's one of those things where I'm not so interested. Several years ago, I decided, I was getting more cluster headaches, and I thought, the body's a system. Surely there are times that, you felt incredibly good between the ages of this. And looking back to that, what might be patterns that are happening there that might be, or that you're overlooking. And it gave me an opportunity to step back and start reviewing those sorts of things. And I think I've always been N=1 in terms of experiments, even when I'm, decide to put patients on particular diets. I say, well, I've got to try that first and see how horrendous it is, or is that fine, or is that practical, or is that even going to work? So I think life is an experiment. I often talk to my kids about it being the big game or the big experiment. You've got to try things. Don't be afraid to try things. And I think that's the same with our boys too. There's they often talk about creativity being stifled because of the judgment process, and, constantly going in there, as opposed for them to have ideas and feel safe to say, this isn't a stupid idea, this is a great idea. And I think that was my experiment down at Kindy yesterday, was with the 4 or 5 year olds, listening to what they could do with a particular, so the question I went down to them was, I know you're an incredibly clever bunch. I've got this particular item here, and I need you to help me find out what I could do with that. And the answers were amazing, absolutely phenomenal. And I think, the results of which I will present at the next Scotch Parents meeting, just to sort of highlight that, but to also think about how we might keep that going throughout the years of as boys develop throughout the school, those sort of passions and creativity.
Yeah, some very good insights there. We better wrap it up, I think. Keep doing what you're doing. It's been great working with you so far, and look forward to what we can do in the future.
Yeah, pleasure.
Thanks for coming in.
Thanks very much,
Thank
Heather.
you.
It was great.